So how do you make a living as a writer then? You know, when you don't, you're technically self-employed, aren't you?
Yes, I am. So I live completely off my royalties now. So so I just wow, yeah, I just realized it was just past my third year of being completely live
This is your third year of being royalty.
just royalties. Yeah, no
Wow.
job.
Um, how long was that road?
Um, so when I turned 30, I'd always wanted to be a writer. I'd always wanted to be a writer, and so in high school, you know, I went through my angsty poetry phase, and then I wrote a book in high school. But then I go to university, and like all you do in university is write papers, honestly. And I was exhausted by the time I was done in university. And then I was like, I talked about being a writer, but I never was one. So I turned 30 and I was like, okay, I got to make a choice. Either this is what I want to do, or I just say goodbye to that dream. That was a dream I had when I was young. And I decided, no, that's actually what I want to do. So I'm 43 now, and I have my 20th book is coming out next month. Yeah, so it was I have to buckle down and make a choice, and I made I made a choice. But definitely, it wasn't a quick thing. It wasn't a quick thing at all. Like I had to. I remember a month that I actually had negative 35-cent royalty because there were returns, and so you have to pay that back, right, off the royalty, and it came up to make negative 35 cents, and I was like, that's just the lowest. It was worse than zero, because zero is like, oh, whatever, I didn't sell anything. No, it's worse than that. It's negative. Yeah, so I mean, I went from that to having some really great months and selling lots, and then you go back to not selling as much, and you're like, oh, I peaked. Great. So this is over now. And then you get back again, and then you go back down. So it's like this, it's definitely a roller coaster.
So how did you survive those valleys?
Yeah, I drank a lot, ate a lot of carbs. I ate a lot of carbs. No, I'm in one now. So, so January, February, March, I am probably making a fifth of what I was making those months. And so when I enter those, this is not the first time I've been in one of those, but you go through, like you hit the second month of it and you're like, okay, my career's over. It's doom, destruction, despair. But you kind of got to go, okay, I've done it before. I will do it again. So I like to focus then on all the stuff I've put off. That kind of pressure, because you always have admin work, especially, okay, when you're self-employed, you have admin work. When you're a writer, you have admin work. And when you're a self-employed writer, the admin is through the roof. And so what I do is then when I get in those valleys, I spend my time really just doing the admin work and taking the time to go, I've been putting this off. I will feel better if I do it. And I just write another book.
When was the last time you freelanced? Because I think you used to do other types of work too to help supplement the dream.
Yeah, I think it's been 4 or 5 years since I freelanced. I also used to do contract freelance for companies. But so the job I left 3 years ago, that was kind of the last one where I stopped. They were the last one that I just couldn't leave. Yeah. You get stuck somewhere and you're like, everybody gets along, and then they keep needing someone to do work. Yeah. And you end up in it. But I did freelance for a few years, and that was I could do it because I had enough contacts, first of all, in kind of corporate world to be able to at least get oddball jobs, right? But also then I have a knack that I can actually write pretty fast. So you tell me what you need, tell me how long it needs to be, tell me when it's due, and I can get it done. Which meant that when people had to have something for Monday and it's Friday,
they could count on Krista.
They could call me up, they could email me. And so like I used to help with there was those free magazines with the advertising, but they still had to have articles and all of that stuff in it. Oftentimes their writers, their on-staff writers would not be able to get something done or whatever. And I would get calls and emails first thing in the morning. Can you do this? And I'm like, Yeah, sure. I know. I know someone who's into that. Let me call them, see if they're free. Yeah, I'm cool. I got an interview for you. And so that was really great. And then you get paid extra because it was an emergency.
Time sensitivity.
Yeah. But I just lost the desire to chase it. Honestly, it's a lot of work.
It must have been fun though.
It definitely was. But my health is not as great as it was. And so when I was quite healthy, it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was great. It's not easy money, but it was quick money. Well, freelancing is good if you have like a wide range of expertises and interests as well. Yeah. Because if you're kind of like, if you've worked a lot of like corporate jobs and day jobs, you have a lot more experience in like lots of odds and ends things as well. And so you can actually pull off all of those things. And then you have the context going, oh, I used to work with a guy. Let me see if he's still there to see if I can get an interview and get some points because he's like the expert on this, or he's expert enough, or, you know, I'm pretty sure she used to do that like before she came to work with us. Let me call. And so that was just really great. And it was easy, but I think if you just got out of the university, it would be tougher. But at the same time, if you have an interest, then that's fine too. Yeah, no, don't diminish. Like, one of the things that really frustrates me is that people diminish their accomplishments, and there's no need for that. I find it a lot with shyer guys and women, and it's like we're not allowed to talk about anything. People, talk about who you are and what you can do. We all have interests, and we all have knowledge. We don't know everything, but what we know, we know.
But there's almost a market for anything out there now.
Oh, for heaven's sakes. I wrote a book on food history. I wrote a book on what it was like to be an ordinary person living in London in 1850.
That was the Harlots book?
Yeah, that was the Hustlers, Harlots, and Heroes. There's a market for knowledge. And so, and one of the great things about niche knowledge is that there's a bigger market. Like, it's so niche that people can't find that knowledge and need you to talk to them about it. And if you can pull it off in a different or fun way, then, hey, all the better.
You've got a third book on the way, I think, where you're
yes.
using history and fantasy.
Yeah, that one I'm looking at like 2021. Yeah. Because I mean, those books take a fair bit of work.
Well, they have a lot of research.
Yeah.
More so than the average fantasy novel.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. There's a significant amount of research with them, and then of course you still have to write it. So they're a fair bit of work. So the third one probably won't be out until like 2021, in that range. The nonfiction books I wrote specifically were for 3 different types of reader: the writer, the fantasy reader, and the person who likes history. It was definitely a unique challenge because sometimes those 3 people actually aren't connected. But one of the things that we were able to do with fantasy as well is that some of the writers really want realism, but they don't think about realism in terms of really small things. They always think about, it must be all these guys in suits of armor. But that's actually only realistic for a very small section of history, both in terms of timeline and in terms of people. Whereas trying to get your cheese from point A to point B is a universal challenge for a lot of people throughout history.
That's its own adventure.
That's its own adventure. Trying to figure out how to do the laundry is its own adventure. Trying to figure out how food works is just such its own thing. And so it's a lot of fun to then really talk about what actually this is all like.
Well, yeah, because the potato thing, like potatoes introduced like a few hundred years ago to Europe or something?
Yeah, I can't remember what it was, 1600s.
Everybody's like showing these like early medieval peasants just eating their potatoes.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever, that's cool if that's like Dragonlance or something.
Yeah, and I don't care. Like, a lot of people think that I'm like really strict with that. I'm like, no, I don't care. But it is kind of fun to then because I get into arguments about people like, well, it needs to be realistic. So we're using realism to justify misogyny and sexism in our books. And I'm like, okay, okay. So this fantasy book with dragons and magic and demons and wizards, realistic. You want it realistic to the medieval times. These buttons didn't exist. These buckles didn't exist. This cloth didn't exist. This sewing style didn't exist. These potatoes didn't exist. This brand of carrot didn't exist. So this religion that you made up didn't exist. This form of atheism or this form of agnosticism didn't exist in the popular, whatever. And so it's like, we got to balance this here, guys.
Yeah. So they pick that aspect to focus their historicity on.
Yes, yeah, and so that is definitely my pet peeve. But I try to make it a little bit more fun and saying, oh, the realism.
Well, it's little things, right?
Yeah.
And some people, and I'm not trying to put them down, but some people that will ruin it for them.
Yeah.
The experience if they see something like, well, how dare that guy have that type of sword? They didn't even make that type of metal even
exactly.
in that area of the world if it's, whatever.
So, and that's why I think there's a balance here. So, I mean, it is fantasy. It is made up. Especially, like, historical fantasy is different because that is real world. Like, it's based in real world.
Yeah.
But secondary world, made up world is made up.
Yeah.
I hate the word realism for that.
Yeah.
Consistent, I think, is the word that we need.
That's probably better.
Consistent makes much more sense. So how I have to organize is that every 6 months or so, 6 months or 8 months, I actually sit down and look at what is coming. So I have to look at both the short term, what I need to get done now, but also what I need to get some work done on, because otherwise I'm going to be frantic in 10 or 11 months from now. So every so often I just sit down for a weekend and I go through everything I want to have done in the next year.
This is that admin mode.
Yes,
order, right?
definitely. So I sit down and I think about what I want done in the next year. And then I work backwards as to, if I want this done in the next year, how do I get this to happen? So that means that in this month this needs to happen, which means in this month this needs to happen, and I work my way right back to now.
Kind of like an editorial schedule?
Yeah. It's it's the same thing almost. If you know that it has to come out in a certain day, but then that means that the proofreaders need to get it, then the editor needs to get it, then you need to have the cover done, you need to have this, you need to give yourself enough time to do this, then that means you have this much time left to write it, and then you go, that's not realistic, so then you push everything. But there's no other way to do it other than to sit down and actually look at it. So every so often I do that. If you're only writing one book in one series, or one book that's a standalone, then another book that's a standalone, you can kind of get away with it. But I'm balancing basically, 4 series right now. I'd actually have to think how many series I'm balancing. I can't, there's not enough space in my brain to organize it that way.
So how do you use some software or something?
Not really. No, I just really put it down on a sheet of paper and figure it around, and until I get it organized. And then once I have it organized, then I can at least then go, the next month I do this, the next week I do this. And then I break it down by week, the word count I need for the week on this project. And sometimes I'm writing 2 books in the same time sometimes. So I need to know I'm writing this many words in this book, this many words in this book.
Struggle with writer's block much?
Writer's block generally for me means I'm burned out.
Yeah.
So writer's block can be a couple of different things. So it can be, like, at least for me, I found that, like, sometimes writer's block is your health. If your health is not there, definitely that's something you need to look after. But then there's also the story isn't just working for me, and it's not that I have blocked, is literally I can't figure out the story. So it's not working for me because my writing brain knows that this is not working. And sometimes you need to sit down and write down the outline of what you've done so far. You need to look at where you're going and then figure how to get there. Because it's usually that happens in the middle where you've been kind of pantsing it through. And then you're like, we kind of can't figure out what to do. You got to actually figure it out.
For some people, pantsing is an amazing way to go.
I find a lot of people who pants generally still know where it's ending up.
Yeah.
So if you know where it's going, you can at least get there. And sometimes if it's that you're burned out. So like I always tell the story, I don't actually remember much about 2015. 2015 is a blur for me. I was working one of my jobs. You know what, 2015 is when I quit freelancing. Now, you see, I couldn't even remember. That's how rough that year was. So 2015 was, I quit freelancing, I think the Christmas before, so 2014. So I quit freelancing because I was too busy. Then I was still working the contract job. So I was writing at the contract job. And then I published 4 books that year. And I wrote 5 books that year. I barely remember anything. And I remember I hit a spot that year where my brain just said, enough. You're done. You're done. And I remember I spent 5 weeks in my pajamas and I barely left the house. And I played Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 and Dragon Age 2 in like rotation, over and over and over. I think I put in like 180 hours into Dragon Age 2, which is a very short video game, in those 5 weeks of I just played it over and over and over and over. And I kind of like, okay, I got it back. And I just went right back in and wrote my books again. Like, I was burned out.
How does that affect family life?
Sometimes, so like that's why the schedule is really important. Because the schedule then allows most of the time to be pretty consistent. Don't bug me in the mornings. If you want me to call around, if you need me for this, you need me to that, I do it in the afternoons because I hate writing in the afternoons anyway. So I often will write at night if I couldn't get stuff done in the mornings. So we kind of get used to our own schedule. But then when, for whatever reason, I couldn't get something done and it's due and it needs to get written, I let everybody know, next 3 weeks, you're on your own.
How much does having a publisher help with this stuff?
Well, so I have a publisher for my nonfiction. So I work with Taiki Books. They are a small Canadian press out of Calgary. I don't think that I would do the nonfiction if I didn't have someone helping, because nonfiction is so much work. And then there's the artwork needs and the layout needs, and it's just like it's the work, and then it's literally all that work again on something else. And it's because nonfiction, people want print for nonfiction as well. So I have to like definitely make sure that there's a lot of print, and I don't really focus on print in my self-published stuff. And so what's really great is to work with someone who can look after that. And so that has been really great for me. And we're a good partnership.
And they kind of are motivating you at the same time.
As much as anyone can motivate me against my will. But definitely there is the Krista, if you're going to do the 3rd book, I need to know now. Because I'm booking 2.5 years in advance, so I need to know what you're doing. And so you can then at least have someone who has that conversation with you to go, you need to get off your ass. So I get asked all the time, like, is it for me? Like, are you saying that I should self-publish? And I was like, I think it really depends, because it's a lot of work to self-publish. It can be as cheap or as expensive as you want it to be. But I always say self-publishing allows you to do whatever you want. And the bad side of that is self-publishing allows you to do whatever you want, even if you don't know what you're doing, or if what you want is actually wrong. So there's nobody there to tell you differently. And it can be really demoralizing if you self-publish your book and you sell 20 copies and then that's the only 20 copies you ever sell.
Yeah.
And that can be pretty demoralizing. I think that and some people are like, well, I want to do self-publishing because I want total control. That can be a good thing for some people. That can actually be a really bad thing for some people. So I think you need to think about what specifically you want total control over and why you want that, because that isn't always the best option. And then you kind of have to think through, like, are you willing to spend your free time reading about how things get out and how people gain audiences, and not listening to just like, well, I the one type of person all the time. Listening to different types of people who do different types of things in the self-publishing world. And it can be a little overwhelming and it can be a little discouraging. Like, so there's a great podcast. I'll give you an example. There's a podcast out there called the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast. It's a great podcast. But they have people, they always have guests, right, who talk about their niche in publishing. And so it can be a little discouraging for somebody who's selling 4 books a month to get on there, who is and then listen for an hour to someone who's making about $250,000 a year, talking about how they spend $3,000 to $5,000 a month in advertising and how that's what you need to do in order to succeed. You have to. That can be really discouraging. But so then I also recommend that what you do then, there's nothing wrong with listening to those things even when you're starting out, because you get to pick out, well, I can't do literally any of this, but oh, she's talking about how she does that. Oh, I can do those, but instead of spending $3,000, I can spend $5. And so then you can pick it apart. But then you go, okay, there's a writer called David Cochran. David Cochran writes books on the nitty-gritty of just how this works. The step-by-step, the processes. And for some people, that's what they need, because they're still trying to learn how to set up a mailing list. How do people know I have a new book out?
Yeah.
You need somebody to walk you through that as well. And so it takes a little bit, and it's really important to try to make different types of connections. And if all of that sounds daunting and horrible and literally like hell, you got to think about maybe there's other options for you.
Yeah.
Because I do a lot of work. Like, I work hard, and I don't just work hard on my writing. I work hard on literally everything else that goes with it, so I can actually have the independence of publishing. But it's not for everyone. Yes, you have to work on the next book, no matter what. It is always easier to sell more books when you have more books. I know that seems like just like a little bit trite, but no, seriously, I can tell you with 19 books out, 20, and the 20th is on pre-order, in fact. So I basically have 20 books out. It is so much easier to sell a book than when I only had one. It's the math of it. Also, then when you decide you're going to start spending money advertising and promoting, if you spend money and you only have one book out, there is a limit to how much they can read of you. When you have a whole bunch of books out, yeah, it just keeps going.
Throughout all this, just write.
Right.
Just keep writing.
Right.
Be a writer.
Be a writer. It is so easy to get distracted and forget that you're actually supposed to write.